The rope bit deep into Nora Ellison's wrists as Mayor Cornelius Phelan forced her to her knees in Cinder Bluff's dusty Main Street. Her two sons, Samuel and Jacob, knelt beside her 12-year-old Samuel's hands, trembling uncontrollably despite his efforts to appear brave, while 8-year-old Jacob pressed so close to her side that she could feel his small body shaking with each terrified breath. Thomas. Her husband's name echoed in her mind like a prayer as she stared at the faces surrounding them. These same people had wept at Thomas's funeral just 8 months ago, had praised his honesty, his generosity, his devotion to family. Mrs. Carmichael, the schoolteacher who had taught her boys their letters, now stood at the crowd's edge with her face turned away, her hand pressed to her mouth as if to keep her conscience from escaping. That single gesture of avoidance cut deeper than any blade. Let this be a lesson to anyone who thinks they can defy the lawful progress of this town. Phelan announced, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. The shearing scissors in his meaty hands caught the afternoon sun, sending sharp glints across faces that had once called her friend. You chose to stand against the railroad, Mrs. Ellison, against prosperity, against the future itself. Nora's throat constricted as she recognized other faces in the crowd, Pastor Williams, who had spoken so beautifully at Thomas's graveside. Young Tom Bradshaw, whose groceries she'd paid for when his mother was sick. Even Dr. Martinez, who had delivered both her sons, all of them watching, all of them silent, all. That land holds my husband's sweat and blood. She whispered, her voice barely audible above the desert wind. It's all my boys have left of their father. Sentiment won't feed your family or build this town's future. Phelan replied coldly, his pale eyes gleaming with satisfaction. But perhaps a little public shame will teach you the price of stubbornness. The first cut sent auburn strands cascading to the dirt like fallen leaves. Nora bit her lip until she tasted blood, determined not to cry out and frighten her children further. But when Phelan grabbed Samuel's sandy hair, her eldest son's jaw clenched with such defiance that she feared he might do something foolish. "Don't," she mouthed to him, and something in her desperate expression made the boy's fists unclench. Jacob began to sob as the scissors moved to his small head, his cries echoing off the storefronts like the wails of a wounded animal. "Mama, why are they hurting us? We didn't do anything wrong." The question hung in the air like an accusation. Several faces in the crowd turned away, but no one spoke. No one moved to help. The silence felt heavier than the desert heat crushing down on Nora's shoulders as she realized the depth of her isolation. When it was over, when 3 bald heads gleamed pale in the dying light, Phelan stepped back to admire his handiwork. There. Now everyone will know what happens to those who put their own selfish interests above the common good. As the crowd began to disperse like vultures abandoning a carcass, old Adele Jensen pushed through the mass of departing faces. Her weathered hands trembled as she pressed a small bundle into Nora's bound hands, bread wrapped in cloth still warm from her oven. "God forgive us all," she whispered, her voice breaking with shame. "God forgive us for what we've become." Then she too was gone, leaving the Ellison family alone in the street where Thomas had once walked with pride, where he had shaken hands and made honest deals, where his sons had played and laughed in better days that now seemed like distant dreams. The November wind cut through Nora's thin coat like a blade as she stumbled through Cinder Bluff's empty streets, her sons clinging to her arms like drowning children. Her scalp burned from the cold, naked and vulnerable, without the hair that had once been her crown of pride. Each step away from the town square felt like a small death, the death of trust, of community, of everything she had believed about human decency. Samuel walked beside her with his jaw set in a way that made her heart ache. At 12, he was trying so desperately to be the man his father would have wanted, but she could see the cracks in his composure. His hands shook despite his efforts to appear strong, and his eyes darted nervously at every shadow, every closed door, every turned-away face. Jacob made no pretense of bravery. He wept openly, his small hand reaching up again and again to touch his shorn head in disbelief. "Mama, when will it grow back? When will people stop looking at us like we're animals?" Samuel finished bitterly, his young voice cracking with pain and rage. "Soon, my darlings." Nora lied, pulling them both closer. "Soon everything will be different." But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if any of them would live long enough to see their hair grow back. The desert stretched before them, vast and merciless under the star-drunk sky. She had no money, no food beyond Adele's crust, no destination except away from the cruelty behind them. They reached the edge of town as the last oil lamp flickered out in Mrs. Carmichael's window. Nora had hoped foolishly, desperately, that the schoolteacher might take pity on them. But the window went dark as they approached, and she heard the distinct sound of a bolt sliding home. Even her. Samuel said quietly, his young voice bitter with understanding. "Even someone who taught us about kindness and courage." Nora had no answer for that. How could she explain that fear made cowards of even good people? How could she help her children understand that survival sometimes demanded the abandonment of principle? The sheep trail they followed seemed to lead into emptiness itself. Nora's bare feet left bloody prints in the dust. By the time they found shelter, a shallow cave formed by two massive boulders that provided scant protection from the desert's killing cold. She gathered her sons close, wrapping her inadequate coat around all three of them. Jacob curled against her chest, his small body still shaking with exhaustion and shock. Samuel tried to maintain his brave facade, but she could feel his tears soaking through her dress. "Tell us about Papa." Jacob whispered, his voice small and broken. "Tell us about when he was strong and everything was good." Nora closed her eyes, summoning memories of Thomas, his gentle hands, his quiet strength, his unwavering belief that hard work and decency would provide for his family. "He built our house with his own hands." She began, her voice soft in the darkness. "Every board, every nail. He said it would stand for 100 years, a legacy for his sons and their sons after them. Will we ever see it again?" Samuel asked, his voice barely audible. The question hung in the cold air like a challenge to hope itself. Nora stared up at the stars scattered across the vast sky, each one a reminder of how small and helpless they were in the face of such immensity. That was when she heard it, and the soft crunch of careful footsteps on gravel, the whisper of leather against stone. Her body went rigid with terror. Had Phelan sent men to finish what he'd started? Her arms tightened protectively around her sons as a shadow appeared at the mouth of their shelter. The man who stepped into the starlight was unlike anything she had expected. Tall and lean, with weathered copper skin and long black hair bound with leather strips, he wore buckskin clothing decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the moonlight like scattered diamonds. A Lakota warrior, she realized, with a mixture of fear and confusion. But it was his eyes that stopped her from screaming, dark and intelligent, filled with an understanding of suffering that transcended race or language. There was something in his gaze that spoke of losses too deep for words of pain, that had been transformed into wisdom rather than bitterness. Chief Kangji had been tracking the Ellison family since dawn, following the trail of blood from the woman's wounded feet and the distinctive pattern of their desperate flight. He had witnessed their humiliation from the hills above Cinder Bluff, hidden among the scrub oak as that pig Phelan performed his cruel theater for the entertainment of cowards. The sight had awakened memories he had tried for years to bury. His own children, Little Fox and Singing Bird, lost to cavalry bullets at Wounded Knee. His wife, Gentle Rain, dead from the spotted sickness that followed the soldiers like a curse. His people scattered to the winds like autumn leaves before a storm. But older memories stirred as well, memories that challenged the oath he had sworn never to trust another white face. 8 winters ago, When he lay bleeding in a ditch with a cavalry saber wound that should have been his death, a white woman named Mary Hutchins had found him. She could have left him to die, should have left him for the safety of her own family. Instead, she had hidden him in her root cellar, fed him soup with her own hands, and changed his bandages while her husband was away trading in the next settlement. He never learned why she chose mercy over fear, but her kindness had saved his life. The debt of mercy his grandmother had always taught him creates ripples that spread across generations. Now, looking down at this broken family, he saw Mary's face again in the firelight of memory. "Do not fear," he said in careful English, his voice barely above a whisper. "I bring no harm to you or your children." Nora's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird, but something in the man's tone, gentle, almost reverent, kept her from screaming. "Please," she managed, her voice cracking. "They're just babies. Whatever you want, take it from me, but don't hurt them." Kangji studied the sleeping boys, noting the way the younger one's face was streaked with dried tears, the protective way the older boy's arm lay across his brother's chest, even in sleep. Warriors, both in their own small way. "I know what was done to you in the white man's town," he said, his voice heavy with shared pain. "I have seen such justice before. It brings honor to no one and healing to nothing. What do you want from us?" Nora asked, surprised by her own boldness in the face of everything she had been taught to fear. "Nothing," Kangji replied simply. "But I have something to offer. My people have a camp hidden in the hills where the cavalry cannot find us. You will find food there, warmth, safety for your children, medicine for your wounded feet." Nora stared at his outstretched hand, her mind racing through a lifetime of warnings about savage Indians and their cruelty. But this man could have taken them by force, could have left them to die in the cold. Instead, he offered sanctuary when her own people, her own neighbors, had shown only cruelty. "Why?" She whispered the word, carrying all her confusion and desperation. Kangji was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the starlight like pools of ancient wisdom. "Because once when I was dying far from home, a white woman chose mercy over fear. She saved my life and asked nothing in return. Some debts can only be paid forward, passed from one generation to the next, until the circle is complete." The Lakota camp lay hidden in a box canyon, 4 hours' walk from their shelter, accessible only through a narrow passage between towering red cliffs that seemed to scrape the belly of the sky itself. As they approached in the pre-dawn darkness, Nora could see the warm glow of banked cook fires reflecting off canvas teepees, and hear the soft murmur of voices speaking in a language that sounded like wind through prairie grass. Jacob had awakened during the journey, and now clung to his mother's hand with desperate strength, his eyes wide with wonder and fear as they passed between the massive stone guardians that concealed the canyon's entrance. Samuel walked beside Chief Kangji, his young face serious as he tried to process this unexpected turn in their fortunes. The camp held perhaps 30 souls, men, women, and children, who had refused to submit to reservation life, choosing instead the hard freedom of exile. They looked up as Kangji led the white family into their circle, their faces showing everything from curiosity to open hostility. An elderly woman rose from beside the largest fire, her gray hair braided with silver ornaments that caught the firelight like stars. Her weathered face was stern with disapproval as she spoke rapidly in Lakota, her voice sharp with accusation. Other voices joined hers, some angry, others worried, all focused on the pale strangers who had invaded their sanctuary. "My Aunt Winona asks why we should risk bringing soldiers down upon us for whites who have shown us only hatred." Kangji translated his tone, respectful but firm. "She remembers Sand Creek, where cavalry butchered women and children under a flag of truce. She remembers promises broken and treaties burned for the white man's convenience." A young warrior with a jagged scar across his cheek stepped forward, his voice harsh with fresh bitterness. "I am Tatanka. I got this mark from a cavalry saber at Little Bighorn. My father died at Wounded Knee with a prayer on his lips and a bullet in his back. Why should we trust those who would see us all dead or caged? Because, Kangji replied, switching to English, so the Ellisons could understand, these are not soldiers or settlers seeking our land. They are refugees, as we are refugees. Look at the marks their own people put upon them. He gestured to Nora's shorn head, to the way her sons pressed close to her sides, like wounded animals seeking shelter. They were cast out for refusing to surrender what was rightfully theirs. They know now what it means to be hunted by those who should protect them. Another warrior, this one older with graying braids, spoke up from the shadows. And when the cavalry comes looking for them, when they follow the trail of white faces to our hidden place. What then, nephew? Winona studied Nora with eyes that seemed to see into her very soul, measuring not just her words, but the weight of her spirit. After a long moment, she reached out and gently touched Jacob's bald head, her fingers tracing the pale skin with unexpected tenderness. The boy didn't flinch, meeting her gaze with the innocent trust of childhood. The sacred hoop teaches us that all suffering is connected, the old woman said in heavily accented English. Perhaps the spirits brought these lost ones to us for a purpose we do not yet understand. She looked directly at Kangji, her ancient eyes holding depths of wisdom and sorrow. But if harm comes to our people because of this choice, nephew, the responsibility will be yours alone to bear. Kangji nodded gravely, understanding the weight of what he was accepting. I have carried heavier burdens, grandmother. If the spirits demand payment for this mercy, they will find me ready. The debate continued for another hour, voices rising and falling like wind through the canyon walls. But gradually, the tide turned in favor of sanctuary. The children of the camp, less burdened by adult fears and grievances, had begun to approach Samuel and Jacob with shy curiosity. One little girl, perhaps Jacob's age, offered him a strip of dried meat with a gap-toothed smile that transcended language. By the time the council ended, Nora and her sons had been assigned a small teepee near the canyon's wall, furnished with warm buffalo robes and a small fire pit that promised the first genuine warmth they had felt in days. Winona herself brought them a bowl of stew made from venison and wild turnips, the first hot meal they had eaten since their exile. As Nora tucked her exhausted sons into the soft robes, she felt an emotion she had almost forgotten: hope. These people, whom she had been taught to fear as bloodthirsty savages, had shown her family more kindness in one evening than their Christian neighbors had shown in years. Mama, Samuel whispered as she settled beside him, are we really safe now? Nora smoothed her hand over his shorn head, feeling the soft stubble beginning to grow like the first green shoots of spring. For tonight, my brave boy. For tonight we're safe. But even as she spoke the words, she couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. Men like Phelan didn't forgive defiance, and they certainly didn't forget humiliation. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the canyon walls, she could almost feel his hatred reaching out toward them like grasping fingers. The third day in the hidden canyon brought news that would change everything. A young warrior named Chayton burst into the camp at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat and foam, his face grim with urgency that needed no translation. Riders, he gasped in English, his chest heaving from the hard ride. Many riders, armed men with a guide who knows the old trails. Kangji and several other warriors gathered around the messenger, their expressions growing darker as he spoke in rapid Lakota. Nora felt her stomach clench with familiar dread as she recognized the tone, if not the words. Danger was coming, and it was coming fast. Your Mayor Phelan has offered a reward. Kangji told her, his voice carved from stone. $100 for information leading to your capture. He calls you dangerous fugitives and us hostile savages harboring criminals. Blood drained from Nora's face. $100 was more money than most people in Cinder Bluff saw in a year. Do you think someone will? Someone already has. Chaitin interrupted, his young face twisted with betrayal and grief. The guide leading them is Mahpe Tatanka's cousin. He rides with 28 armed men, leading them straight to our sanctuary. The camp erupted in shocked voices and angry accusations. Mahpe was known to them all, a warrior of 20 winters who had grown increasingly bitter since his father's death in the agency. He had spoken often of glory, of counting coup against the whites, but no one had imagined he would stoop to outright betrayal. Why would he do such a thing? Nora asked, though she already dreaded the answer. Tatanka's scarred face was a mask of pain as he answered. Because he believes that if he delivers you to the whites, they will see our band as useful allies instead of threats. He thinks your lives can buy safety for the rest of us. His voice broke with emotion. He is young, and grief has made him foolish. He does not understand that the white man's mercy is like morning mist, beautiful to see, but gone the moment you try to grasp it. Winona spat into the fire, her ancient face contorted with disgust. He is worse than foolish. He is blind. The whites will take his 30 pieces of silver and hunt us down anyway. They always do. The next few hours passed in a blur of desperate preparation. The women and children were moved to the deepest part of the canyon, where overhanging rocks provided natural shelter from gunfire. The warriors checked their weapons and discussed strategy in urgent whispers, their faces grim with the knowledge that they were outnumbered and outgunned. But as they prepared for what might be their final battle, Kangji pulled Nora aside for a conversation that would shatter everything she thought she knew about her husband's death. "There is something you must know," he said, his voice heavy with long-buried pain. "About your Thomas. About why Phelan truly wants your land." Nora's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" Kangji's eyes grew distant, looking back across years of sorrow. 3 years ago, before the railroad interest came to your territory, Phelan led a gang of men in an attack on a Lakota hunting party. They killed 6 warriors, including my brother Swift Eagle, and stole our horses. But your husband saw them coming back, saw the blood on their hands and the stolen ponies with Lakota markings. The world seemed to tilt around Nora as the pieces fell into place. Thomas never said anything about, because Phelan threatened to kill you and your sons if he spoke. Kangji continued, his voice breaking with the weight of old grief. Your husband made a deal with the devil, his silence in exchange for your safety. He carried that burden to his grave, knowing that speaking the truth would mean your death. Asarm. Nora sank to her knees, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning. Thomas had died knowing that his family's safety depended on his silence about murder. He had watched his wife struggle to hold on to their land, had seen her suffer and worry and fight, all while carrying the terrible knowledge that could have explained everything. "Why are you telling me this now?" she whispered. "Because you deserve to know that your husband was truly a hero," Kangji replied. "And because, when Phelan comes, you will understand that this battle is about more than just your family's survival. It is about justice for all his victims, white and Lakota alike." The attack came at dawn on the 5th day, announced by the acrid smell of smoke and the sound of horses' hooves echoing off canyon walls like thunder. Phelan had spent the night positioning his force, 28 townsmen, and hired guns plus Mapi as their unwilling guide. The plan was brutal in its simplicity: smoke them out like prairie dogs, and then capture or kill everyone who emerged. From her position among the women and children in the deepest part of the canyon, Nora could see the smoke beginning to billow through the narrow entrance. Jacob clung to her side, his small body shaking with each gunshot that echoed off the stone walls. Samuel had taken a position where he could watch the warriors preparing their defense, his young face set with determination that reminded her painfully of his father. "They mean to burn us out," Winona observed with grim practicality, her ancient eyes reflecting the growing flames. "The wind carries the fire toward us. Soon we will have no choice but to flee deeper into the canyon or face them at the entrance where they wait with their guns." Is there another way out? Nora asked desperately, though she already knew the answer from the resignation in the old woman's voice. Winona shook her head slowly. This place has been our strength, and now it becomes our prison. The spirits are testing our courage, child. We must not fail them in this hour. Kangji had positioned his warriors, 14 men and 2 women skilled with bow and rifle, at strategic points, where the canyon walls provided cover. The narrow entrance meant Phelan's superior numbers were meaningless. Only a few men could advance at a time, and they would be exposed to crossfire from above. But the fire changed everything. As smoke thickened and flames crept closer, the defenders found their positions becoming untenable. Several warriors were already coughing violently, their aim wavering as their eyes streamed with tears. The ancient stone that had protected them for generations now seemed to trap the smoke, turning their sanctuary into a death chamber. We cannot hold here much longer. Tatanka reported to his chief, his voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. The fire drives us like cattle toward the slaughter pen. Soon we will have no choice but to charge their guns or suffocate like rats in a hole. That was when they heard Mapi's voice calling from beyond the flames, speaking in Lakota to his hidden kinsman. The words carried clearly in the smoke-filled air, each syllable a dagger thrust into the heart of tribal loyalty. My brothers, the young traitor shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. I bring a way to end this without more bloodshed. Send out the white woman and her spawn, and Phelan will let the rest of you live. I have his word as a white man. The canyon erupted in chaos as warriors realized the depth of the betrayal. Tatanka's roar of fury echoed off the stone walls, but it was Winona who responded with words that sealed Mape's fate. You are no longer Lakota. She called back in English, ensuring Phelan could understand every word. You are crow shit beneath our feet. Your name will be forgotten, and your spirit will wander without rest. Mape's reply came not in words, but in action. He appeared at the canyon mouth with his hands raised in apparent surrender, calling out to Phelan in broken English. The woman is here. I bring her to you for the gold you promised. But first you must call off your men so I can bring her out safely. But even as he spoke those words of betrayal, Tatanka's arrow sprouted from his chest like a flower of death. The young traitor looked down in surprise, then crumbled to the ground, his blood mixing with the sacred earth he had defiled with his treachery. Forgive me, cousin, Tatanka whispered, his scarred face streaming with tears. You chose the path of darkness, but I will remember the boy you were before grief made you into something else. Phelan's voice boomed across the canyon, no longer amused by the morning's entertainment. Well, that's what we get for trusting a redskin. Boys, looks like we do this the hard way. Burn them all out and shoot anything that moves. The Battle of Hidden Canyon began in earnest. As the first group of attackers pushed through the smoke-filled entrance, their rifles blazing orange flowers of death in the gray haze. The narrow space amplified every sound. The crack of gunfire, the screams of wounded men, the terrified whinnying of horses, and the constant crackle of flames consuming everything in their path. Kangji had prepared for this moment by having his warriors roll massive boulders to the narrowest point of the canyon entrance. When Phelan's men tried to charge through the first wave, stumbled over the stone barrier, and found themselves exposed to devastating crossfire from the canyon walls above. 3 of Phelan's men fell in the first volley, their bodies blocking the entrance and forcing their companions to climb over them. But the defenders' position was precarious, ammunition was running dangerously low, and the spreading fire made breathing in agony that threatened to end the battle before it truly began. Chief Tatanka called from his position behind a fallen boulder, his voice barely audible above the chaos. They're trying to flank us from the eastern wall. Kangji looked up through the smoke to see 6 men climbing the treacherous slope, their rifles glinting in the fire-filtered sunlight. If they reached the top, they would have clear shots at the defenders and could rain death down on the women and children cowering in the sacred caves. Winona, he shouted toward the shelter area. Take the young ones to the deepest cave now. The evacuation began in earnest, but even as the most vulnerable sought deeper shelter, the battle took a terrible turn. One of Phelan's men had brought a stick of dynamite, stolen from the railroad supplies, and now the explosion shattered the carefully positioned boulder barrier, opening the entrance to a full assault. It was then that Samuel Ellison proved he was truly his father's son. Breaking away from his mother's desperate grip, he snatched up a fallen warrior's bow and scrambled toward the firing line. His first arrow caught one of the climbing attackers in the shoulder, sending the man tumbling back down the slope with a scream that echoed off the canyon walls. "Samuel, no." Nora cried, but her voice was lost in the thunder of battle. Seeing the boy's courage, Kangji felt something stir in his heart that he had thought dead since Wounded Knee Hope. This white child with his shorn head and fierce eyes was willing to die alongside people he had known for less than a week. Perhaps there was still honor left in the world after all. But the battle was far from over. As the smoke grew thicker and the ammunition dwindled, it became clear that courage alone would not be enough. The Lakota warriors fought with the desperation of those protecting their families, but they were being slowly pushed back toward the sacred caves where the women and children waited. It was in this darkest moment that Winona made a choice that would be remembered in song and story for generations to come. The ancient woman keeper of the sacred healing herbs emerged from the caves with a bundle of dried plants that she threw onto the fire. The smoke that rose was different, thicker, more acrid, carrying with it the power of generations of medicine knowledge. The smoke blew directly into the faces of Phelan's advancing men, causing them to cough and retch violently. Several dropped their weapons, temporarily blinded and gasping for clean air. It was the diversion the defenders needed, but it came at a terrible cost. Winona collapsed from the effort, her ancient body finally succumbing to the strain of the battle. "Grandmother," Kangji cried, catching her as she fell. "The circle must be completed," she whispered, her failing eyes fixing on Nora. The white woman. She must know the truth about the mayor's past. As Winona's spirit departed for the hunting grounds of her ancestors, the battle reached its crescendo. Phelan himself appeared at the canyon entrance, his face purple with rage and desperation. Behind him came his deputy Roberts and several hired guns, all of them coughing from the medicinal smoke, but still determined to finish what they had started. "Enough!" Phelan roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "I want that woman alive. She's going to pay for what she's cost me." It was then that the truth finally came out, spoken by a man driven beyond reason by greed and the fear of exposure. "You think you're so righteous, Nora Ellison. Your precious husband knew exactly what kind of man I was. He knew I killed those savages 3 years ago, and he kept his mouth shut because he was too much of a coward to face the consequences." Kangji's rifle cracked, and Phelan staggered, looking down in surprise at the spreading red stain on his chest. But the mayor wasn't finished yet. With his dying breath, he pulled out a hidden derringer and aimed it at Jacob, who had emerged from the caves to look for his mother. "If I'm going to hell," Phelan gasped, "I'm taking one of you with me." The gunshot echoed through the canyon like the crack of doom itself. But it wasn't Phelan's derringer that fired, it was the rifle of Deputy Roberts, who had put a bullet through his boss's heart just as the mayor's finger tightened on the trigger. In the sudden silence that followed, broken only by the crackling of flames and the labored breathing of wounded men, Roberts lowered his smoking rifle and looked around at the carnage with haunted eyes. "My brother," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the smoke-filled air. "My brother was one of the Lakota warriors Phelan murdered 3 years ago. Half-brother born to a Lakota woman who worked for our family. I've been waiting for the right moment to make that bastard pay." The revelation hit the surviving attackers like a physical blow. Several of them, good men who had been misled by Phelan's lies, threw down their weapons in disgust and shame. The few remaining hired guns, seeing the tide of battle turn, began to back away toward the canyon entrance. But before they could escape, another voice cut through the chaos, this one belonging to Adele Jensen, who appeared at the canyon mouth with nearly 24 townspeople behind her. The old woman's face was set with righteous fury as she surveyed the scene of carnage. Cornelius Phelan is dead. She announced, her voice carrying the authority of absolute moral conviction. And with him dies the shame he brought upon our town. We've come to make amends for the wrongs done to the Ellison family and to ask forgiveness from Chief Kangji and his people. Behind her, the townspeople spread out in a rough line, their faces showing a mixture of shame and determination. Among them, Nora was amazed to see Pastor Williams, Dr. Martinez Young, Tom Bradshaw, and even Mrs. Carmichael, the schoolteacher, who had turned away during the public humiliation, now stood with tears streaming down her face. "We failed you," Mrs. Carmichael said, her voice breaking with emotion. "We failed you and your boys when you needed us most. But we're here now, and we're not leaving until this is made right." Dr. Martinez pushed forward with his medical bag, immediately beginning to tend to the wounded from both sides. "Chief Kangji," he said as he worked, "my people wish to offer reparations for the attack on the hunting party 3 years ago. We know now that Phelan led that raid, and we know that good people died because of his greed." As the smoke began to clear and the wounded were tended to, an unlikely gathering took shape around the dying fires. Townspeople and warriors sat together, sharing water and what little food remained, while both Lakota medicine women and Dr. Martinez worked side by side to heal the injuries of the battle. The most surprising moment came when Tatanka approached Nora with tears streaming down his scarred face. "I am sorry," he said in halting English. "My cousin chose darkness over light. But you and your sons fought beside us like family. That makes you family in truth." Nora reached out and touched his arm gently, feeling the solid reality of this man who had been an enemy in her mind just days before. "You're not responsible for his choices. You saved my son's life back there, and that makes us family in the way that truly matters." Samuel stepped up beside his mother, his young face solemn with new understanding. "The kind of family that chooses each other," he said. "The kind that stands together when things get hard." As the sun set behind the canyon walls, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to bless the unlikely gathering below, the work of healing began. Both physical wounds and spiritual ones would take time to mend. But for the first time in years, there was genuine hope for something better. The journey back to Cinder Bluff took 4 days with the wounded, traveling in improvised travois, and the healthy walking alongside the horses in a procession unlike anything the territory had ever seen. Lakota warriors and white townspeople moved together through country that had been a battleground between their peoples for generations. Samuel rode with Tatanka, and the unlikely pair having formed a bond based on mutual respect and shared experience of loss. The boy peppered the warrior with questions about tracking and survival, while Tatanka found himself moved by the child's eagerness to learn from someone most whites would have considered an enemy. "You fight like a warrior," Tatanka told him as they crested a hill overlooking Cinder Bluff's distant rooftops. "But better than that, you fight for others, not for glory. That is the mark of a true protector." Nora walked beside Chief Kangji, both of them keeping pace with Jacob, who had insisted on walking like a big boy despite his exhaustion. The little boy chattered constantly, his natural resilience already beginning to heal the trauma of recent days, though he still unconsciously touched his growing hair whenever he felt nervous. "Will we really be safe now, Mama?" he asked for the 20th time that day. "I believe so, sweetheart," Nora replied, glancing at Kangji, who nodded confirmation. "We have real friends now, people who will help protect us no matter what. Even though our hair is still short." Jacob persisted, running his fingers through the stubble that had grown during their time in the canyon. Kangji smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Hair grows back, little warrior. But courage once shown marks a person forever. You and your brother have shown courage worthy of the greatest chiefs." The reception in Cinderbluff was unlike anything the town had ever experienced. Word of the battle and Phelan's death had preceded them, carried by riders who had departed the canyon early. The entire population had turned out to witness the return of the Ellison family and their unlikely protectors. Some faces in the crowd showed deep shame and regret for their earlier complicity in Phelan's cruelty. Others displayed genuine curiosity about the Lakota warriors who had risked their lives for strangers. A few still showed traces of fear and hostility, but these were clearly outnumbered by those who seemed moved by the sight of former enemies walking together in peace. The new acting mayor, Morrison, stepped forward to address the gathering. His speech was brief but heartfelt, acknowledging the town's failures and promising a new beginning based on justice rather than prejudice. "We cannot undo the wrongs that were done," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "But we can ensure they are never repeated. From this day forward, Cinderbluff will be a place where all citizens are judged by their character, not their appearance or ancestry." But even as the official reconciliation began, a small group of townspeople pushed forward from the back of the crowd. Led by a man named Hutchins, the same Billy Hutchins whose testimony had finally exposed Phelan's crimes, they carried themselves with the grim determination of those who had something difficult to say. "We've got a problem," Hutchins announced, his voice cutting through the celebratory atmosphere like a blade. "There's been talk about the Army coming to investigate reports of Indian uprising in the territory. Some folks sent word to Fort Collins about the battle, claiming it was an unprovoked attack on innocent civilians." The crowd's mood shifted instantly from celebration to concern. Kangji's warriors tensed hands, moving instinctively toward their weapons, while the townspeople looked around nervously at each other. "Who sent word?" Morrison demanded, his banker's training showing in the sharp edge of his voice. "And that's what we're trying to figure out," Hutchins replied. "But whoever it was, they painted the whole thing as a massacre of white folks by hostile Indians. The Army's sending a full patrol to investigate, and they're not likely to listen to explanations when they get here." Chief Kangji stepped forward, his weathered face calm, despite the gravity of the situation. "My people have lived as fugitives for years. If necessary, we can disappear into the hills until this storm passes." "No," Nora said firmly, surprising everyone, including herself, with the strength in her voice. "You saved our lives. You protected us when our own neighbors turned their backs. We're not going to let you run and hide because of lies told by cowards." She turned to face the crowd, her green eyes blazing with the same fierce determination that had driven her to defy Phelan in the first place. "These people are not our enemies. They're our friends, our neighbors, our family. And if the Army wants to hear a different story, then by God, we're going to tell them one." Pastor Williams stepped forward, his usually gentle voice carrying newfound authority. "Mrs. Ellison speaks the truth. I propose we send our own delegation to meet the Army patrol. Let them hear the real story from people they can't dismiss as hostile savages or hysterical civilians." Dr. Martinez nodded agreement. "I'll write a full medical report documenting the injuries sustained by both sides. The evidence will show clearly that this was a defensive action, not an unprovoked attack." The next few hours were filled with intense preparation. Statements were taken from witnesses, evidence was gathered and documented, and a delegation was organized to ride out and meet the approaching Army patrol. Chief Kangji insisted on accompanying the group, despite the obvious danger to himself. "My people's story must be told by my people," he said simply. "If the white man's justice is to be trusted, it must hear all voices, not just those that are comfortable to listen to." The meeting with the Army patrol took place 3 days later at Willow Creek, the same trading post where Phelan had first gathered his posse. Captain Morrison, no relation to the town's acting mayor, listened with growing amazement as the true story unfolded, not the tale of savage attack he had expected, but a complex narrative of injustice, refuge, betrayal, and ultimately redemption. Let me understand this correctly, the captain said, reviewing Dr. Martinez's medical report. Mayor Phelan murdered 6 Lakota warriors 3 years ago, threatened civilian Thomas Ellison to keep him quiet, then publicly humiliated the man's widow and children for refusing to sell land that would benefit his railroad scheme. That's correct, sir. Adele Jensen replied with the kind of moral authority that comes from a lifetime of hard-won wisdom. And when Chief Kangji offered the family sanctuary, Phelan raised an armed posse to attack a peaceful camp that was harboring refugees, not hostiles. The captain studied Chief Kangji with the careful attention of a professional soldier evaluating a potential threat. And you, Chief Kangji, what's your perspective on these events? Kangji met the officer's gaze steadily. I have seen many kinds of white man's justice, Captain. The kind that comes from the end of a rifle, and the kind that comes from the hearts of people who choose mercy over hatred. Today I hope to see which kind you represent. The investigation took 2 more days with testimony from dozens of witnesses and examination of physical evidence from the Canyon battle. In the end, the Army's official report recommended that no action be taken against Chief Kangji's band, and that the territorial governor commend the citizens of Cinder Bluff for their peaceful resolution of what could have become a bloody regional conflict. More importantly, the report recommended that the Lakota band be granted legal status to establish a permanent settlement in the territory, with Chief Kangji and his married warriors filing homestead claims throughout the valley. The months that followed brought changes that transformed not just Cinder Bluff, but the entire surrounding territory. The integration of the 2 communities wasn't without challenges. There were disputes over water rights, conflicts between different approaches to land use, and occasional flare-ups of old prejudices on both sides. But the foundation of mutual respect established during the crisis provided a framework for resolving these conflicts peacefully. Tatanka proved to be a natural mediator, his combat experience giving him credibility with hotheads, while his growing friendship with Samuel provided a living example of successful cooperation. When Tatanka married Maria Santos, Dr. Martinez's niece, in a ceremony that combined Catholic and Lakota traditions, the entire integrated community celebrated together. The wedding, held on a warm June evening, 9 months after the battle, marked a symbolic turning point that even the most skeptical observers could not ignore. The transformation was most apparent in the Ellison family themselves. Samuel threw himself into his studies with renewed vigor, dividing his time between school and the informal lessons and survival skills that Tatanka provided. The boy's experience in combat had matured him beyond his years, but he retained the essential goodness that his father had instilled. Jacob, with the resilience of childhood, seemed to suffer no lasting trauma from their ordeal. He made friends easily among both white and Lakota children, becoming a living bridge between communities that had previously existed in mutual isolation and fear. But it was Nora who underwent the most profound transformation. The woman who had once been broken by public humiliation had emerged from her ordeal with a strength and dignity that commanded universal respect. She had learned that true power lay not in defying oppression alone, but in building alliances that made oppression impossible. The establishment of the territory's first integrated school became her special mission. Working alongside Mrs. Carmichael and Winona's successor as the Lakota spiritual leader, and wise woman named Prairie Flower Nora helped create an educational environment where children of all backgrounds could learn together. When Thomas Ellison's headstone was finally erected in the Cinder Bluff Cemetery, paid for by voluntary contributions from both white and Lakota families, Nora stood before it with her sons and spoke words that would be remembered long after the stone itself had weathered away. "Thomas," she said, her voice steady and clear, "our boys have learned what you always tried to teach them, that courage isn't about being fearless, but about doing what's right, even when you're terrified. They've learned that family isn't just about blood, but about choosing to stand with those who need protection." Samuel, now 14, and showing clear signs of the man he would become, placed his hand on his mother's shoulder. He'd be proud of you too, Mama. You turned our worst day into something that helped a lot of people. Chief Kangji, who had been standing quietly nearby, stepped forward to place a small bundle at the base of the headstone. It contained eagle feathers and sacred sage traditional offerings to honor a fallen warrior. Your husband's spirit lives on in his sons, he told Nora. And in the bridge of understanding that their courage helped build between our peoples. His sacrifice was not in vain. The final surprise came on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after their ordeal began. Nora was working in her garden, the same plot of land that Phelan had tried to steal, when Samuel came running with news that made her heart skip a beat. "I'ma come quick. You need to see what they're doing in town." She followed him to the main street of Cinder Bluff, where a crowd had gathered around the site where she had once been publicly humiliated. Workers were installing a new monument carved from local sandstone and bearing an inscription that brought tears to her eyes. Reconciliation Square, in memory of those who suffered injustice and in honor of those who chose courage over cruelty. Dedicated to the belief that our strength lies not in the power to harm others, but in our willingness to protect the innocent and build bridges across any divide. Below the main inscription in both English and Lakota were the words, "Where enemies became family and healing began." The dedication ceremony drew visitors from across the territory. Territorial Governor Evans himself attended, along with Army officers, railroad executives, and representatives from 3 other communities that wanted to learn from Cinder Bluff's example. But the most memorable moment came when Jacob Ellison, now 12 years old and wise beyond his years, was invited to speak for the children of the integrated community. "A year ago, they cut off our hair to shame us," he said, his young voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "They wanted to mark us as different, as less than other people. But we learned something important. It's not what's on the outside of your head that matters, it's what's inside your heart." He paused, looking out at the mixed crowd of faces, white, Lakota, and Mexican, all listening with rapt attention. "My mama always said that when bad things happen, we can choose to become bitter or better. Our whole town chose better, and that made all the difference. Now we're not just neighbors living near each other. We're family choosing to take care of each other." The applause that followed was long and heartfelt. But it was the sight of former enemies embracing each other that truly marked the transformation. Tatanka and Dr. Martinez stood together with their arms around each other's shoulders. Mrs. Carmichael chatted animatedly with Prairie Flower about educational techniques. Samuel and his Lakota friend Little Wolf raced through the crowd, their laughter a promise of a better future. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Nora found herself standing alone in the square, where she had once knelt in shame and despair. Her hair had grown back completely longer and more beautiful than before. But she would never forget the feeling of vulnerability and abandonment that had driven her to her knees in this very spot. The woman who stood here now was not the same person who had been publicly humiliated by Cornelius Phelan's cruelty. She had been broken and rebuilt, tested by fire, and forged into something stronger than she had ever imagined possible. Chief Kangji approached with his usual quiet dignity, carrying something wrapped in soft deerskin. "I have something that belongs to you," he said, unwrapping a small photograph, the wedding picture of Thomas and Nora that had been salvaged from their burned belongings. "Adele found it in the ashes of Phelan's office," he explained. "He had kept it as a trophy, I think. But it belongs with family." Nora took the photograph, with trembling hands, seeing Thomas's young face smiling back at her across the years. For a moment, the weight of loss threatened to overwhelm her again. But then Samuel and Jacob joined them, along with Tatanka and Maria Prairie Flower and her children, Dr. Martinez and his extended family. All the people who had become her chosen family through trial and triumph. "He would be so proud," she whispered, looking at the photograph. "Not just of what we survived, but of what we built from the ashes. As evening fell and the last visitors departed, the integrated community of Cinder Bluff settled into its peaceful rhythms. In houses throughout the valley, families of different backgrounds tucked their children into bed, with stories of courage and kindness, of enemies who became friends and strangers who became family. The story of the Ellison family's ordeal and redemption would be told and retold for generations, becoming a founding legend of the integrated community that grew up around their experience. Children of all backgrounds would learn about the widow and her sons who chose forgiveness over bitterness, about the Lakota chief who honored an ancient debt of mercy, and about the townspeople who found their courage when it mattered most. But for Nora, Samuel, and Jacob Ellison, the story was simply the foundation of their new life. A life built on the unshakable knowledge that they were loved, protected, and valued by a community that had learned to see past surface differences to the shared humanity beneath. In the growing darkness of the desert evening, their small house stood as a beacon of hope, proof that even in the wildest reaches of the frontier, love could triumph over hate, mercy could overcome cruelty, and broken families could be made whole again through the healing power of chosen community. As Nora tucked her sons into bed and listened to their prayers of gratitude for friends and family and safety, she knew with absolute certainty that Thomas would indeed be proud of who they had all become. The legacy he had left them, integrity, courage, and an unshakable moral compass, had not only survived their trials, but had been strengthened and multiplied through their willingness to share it with others. The circle was complete, the debt of mercy paid forward to future generations. What had begun with cruelty and shame had been transformed into something beautiful and enduring, a living testament to the power of human compassion to overcome any darkness. And in that knowledge, surrounded by the love of family, both born and chosen, they found peace.